The courtroom was packed. Reporters jostled for position, cameras clicked furiously, and murmurs filled the air like static electricity. No one expected him to be called, yet there he stood, Chris Evans, the face of American heroism, about to testify in one of the most scandalous celebrity trials of the decade. Diddy, once a mogul of unmatched power in music and fashion, now faced federal charges that threatened to dismantle everything he had built. And for reasons unknown to the public, Evans was now a key witness. Before we dive into this explosive story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more confidential celebrity revelations. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Chris Evans never imagined he'd be anywhere near a courtroom like this, especially not one involving a man he barely knew. Their paths had crossed only a handful of times at industry events. Diddy had always seemed larger than life, charming, intense, and enigmatic. So when federal agents approached Chris one morning with questions about a night he'd tried hard to forget, his heart sank. It all went back to a party. Not just any party, the party. A post-awards night celebration in the hills, invitation only, with a guest list that included A-listers, tech tycoons, and political donors. Chris had attended reluctantly, still jet-lagged from a press tour, and more interested in slipping away unnoticed than mingling with the elite. But someone had insisted. He remembered the text. "It's going to be important. You should be there." No name, no number, just that message. Hours later, Chris was at the gate of a sprawling estate hidden behind high hedges and heavier security. Flashing cameras blinded him as he passed through, the music thumping like a second heartbeat. Inside, everything shimmered. Gold accents, crystal lights, champagne fountains. But there was something about the place that didn't feel right. A tension under the luxury, like the air before a thunderstorm. He barely got a drink when he was approached by Diddy himself, slick in a midnight blue suit, surrounded by people who seemed to orbit him like satellites. "Glad you made it," Diddy said, voice smooth, eyes unreadable. They exchanged a few words, polite, surface level. But Diddy's gaze kept drifting past Chris, scanning the room as if watching for something. Later that night, while exploring the massive estate, Chris wandered into a corridor away from the main crowd. That's when he heard it. Two voices. One was unmistakably Diddy's. The other belonged to a man Chris couldn't identify. Sharp, clipped tone, almost military. They were speaking in hushed tones near a back entrance. Chris didn't intend to eavesdrop, but the words caught him cold. "Everything's in place," the man said. "It better be," Diddy replied. "Last thing I need is another problem from the East Coast." There was a pause, then, "If he talks, we're done. Then make sure he doesn't." Chris froze. The weight of those words pressed into his chest like a stone. He turned to leave quietly, but at that moment the lights flickered, then died completely. Darkness swallowed the corridor, and distant shouts rose from the main hall. For a few long seconds, silence. Then, a loud bang echoed from somewhere deeper in the mansion. Chris didn't wait to find out what it was. He moved quickly back to the crowd, to the lights now stuttering back on, to the music resuming awkwardly, as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The morning after the party, Chris tried to shake off the strange sense of dread lingering in his chest. He told himself it was just paranoia, maybe too much champagne and not enough sleep. But the words he'd heard, "Make sure he doesn't," echoed louder than any hangover. Something about that exchange was off, dangerous. He didn't speak to anyone about it at first, not his team, not his agent. But days later, he got a call from someone he hadn't seen in years, Jenna Alvarez, talented, sharp, and always a few steps ahead of the Hollywood game. They'd worked together on a film early in their careers and stayed loosely connected. She invited him for coffee, insisting it was urgent. When they met at a tucked-away cafe in Silver Lake, her tone was lower than usual, her eyes scanning the room like she expected someone to be watching. "Chris," she said, her voice tight, "you need to be careful. That party wasn't just a party." He didn't respond right away, but his silence said enough. "I've been hearing things," Jenna continued, "people disappearing, quietly. No news, no explanation. It's like Something's operating behind the curtain. And Diddy? He's not just a party host, he's in deep with people who don't want certain stories coming out. Chris leaned in. What kind of stories? Jenna hesitated, then said, I don't know exactly, but it has to do with money, transport, people, some of it international. He felt the blood drain from his face. Whatever he'd overheard, it was part of something bigger than he'd realized. Still, he couldn't make sense of why he was being dragged into it until that night when he found the phone. He was cleaning out the jacket he'd worn to the party. He hadn't touched it since, and heard something buzz in the inside pocket. It wasn't his phone. The device was cheap, old, the kind you buy at a gas station. No ID, no case. Just a series of cryptic text messages, most of them unread. Transfer confirmed. Port of Long Beach, 4:15 a.m. He's not clean. Handle it. Chris stared at the screen, heart racing. This wasn't a prank. The timestamps matched the night of the party, but how had it ended up in his jacket? That question haunted him. By the end of the week, he received a knock on his door. 2 agents from the FBI, stern and purposeful. They weren't there to arrest him, but the message was clear. You've been mentioned, mister. Heavens, one agent said. We think you may have witnessed something significant. If you withhold information, that could be a problem. Chris felt trapped. He didn't want to be involved. He wasn't a whistleblower, a detective, or a hero. But now, remaining silent was no longer a neutral choice, it was a risk. He agreed to cooperate. The agents told him to keep it quiet for now. No media, no lawyers outside their circle. They'd be in touch. That night, Chris returned home to find a small brown envelope waiting at his door. No postage, no markings. Inside was a single photo, grainy but unmistakable. It showed Chris standing at the party, alone, looking toward the corridor where he'd overheard Diddy's conversation. There was a red X scrawled over his face in thick marker. Chris dropped the envelope. His hands trembled. The message wasn't subtle. Someone wanted him to stay quiet or disappear. But something inside him had shifted. Fear, yes, but also resolve. He wouldn't run. Not this time. The fear didn't fade. It settled into Chris like a second skin. But once the photo arrived, there was no turning back. He met again with the agents, this time in a nondescript government building just outside downtown LA. They explained what cooperation meant: limited protection, strict confidentiality, and the knowledge that his testimony could tip the scales of a case years in the making. Chris agreed. His career might never recover. His name might become tabloid fodder. But if staying silent meant someone else would suffer or vanish, he couldn't do it. Witness protection procedures were initiated, though not full relocation. Too visible. Instead, his movements were tracked, his security detail increased, and his inner circle narrowed to a handful of vetted contacts. Even his publicist wasn't told the full story. Meanwhile, the trial began. It was surreal. Cameras flooded the courthouse steps as protesters and fans gathered daily. Diddy, ever the symbol of power and control, entered with his usual confidence. Tailored suit, sunglasses, expression unreadable. He didn't look like a man facing decades behind bars. He looked like he'd already won. Chris's name came up on the second day. The courtroom buzzed when it was announced. The prosecution presented him as a credible, reluctant witness, a man with nothing to gain and everything to lose. When Chris took the stand, the silence was suffocating. He began with the party, the strange text, the conversation in the corridor. Every detail, every word he remembered. He spoke clearly, but his hands wouldn't stop trembling under the table. Then came the part that froze the room. He recounted his brief interaction with Diddy that night. How Diddy had welcomed him, smiled, and then suddenly said something that didn't make sense at the time. But now, under oath, it rang with a sinister undertone. He said he needed silence from the East Coast side, Chris told the court. The defense objected. The judge overruled. Chris continued. I thought it was metaphorical, maybe a joke, but now I don't think it was. I think it was about shutting someone up. He didn't embellish, he didn't speculate. He simply relayed what he heard, what he saw, what he remembered. But every word tightened the noose. Across the courtroom, Diddy didn't flinch. He watched Chris with the same calm intensity he'd worn at the party. A small, almost imperceptible smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Chris faltered for a second. That smirk, it was a message, a reminder that Diddy wasn't afraid, that maybe he still had control over whatever was really happening. Court recessed for lunch. As Chris stepped outside the witness box, escorted by agents, his phone buzzed. Against protocol, he glanced at it. Unknown number. One message. Wrong move. Next time, it's not just your career. His blood turned cold. He showed it to the agents immediately, who took the device and began tracing the number. Chris sat in the hallway surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. He was no longer a spectator in someone else's story. He was inside it now, and it was only getting darker. Chris barely slept that night. The threat on his phone had been real, specific. His security team upgraded protocols, rotating agents, restricting movement. But safety didn't equal peace of mind. His testimony had shaken the courtroom, but it had also stirred something darker outside of it. Something unseen. The next day he tried to call Jenna. Voicemail, he texted, no response. At first he thought maybe she was avoiding the spotlight. Smart move given the heat he was under. But after 2 more days of silence, worry turned to panic. He drove to her apartment. The building was quiet. He buzzed her number. Nothing. He called from the lobby. No answer. Then he convinced the manager, under the pretext of concern, to check inside. The place was empty. Not just empty, abandoned. Mail stacked at the door, food half-eaten in the fridge, laptop still open on the coffee table. No sign of a struggle, but also no sign of planning. She had vanished without a word. Chris stood in the doorway, the same dread he'd felt at the party flooding back. He knew this wasn't coincidence. Jenna had warned him, and now she was gone. Back at court, things got worse. Diddy's legal team was ruthless. They called in character witnesses against Chris, combed through his old interviews, even suggested he was using the trial for publicity. One attorney implied that Chris had approached the FBI, not the other way around, desperate to stay relevant in a shifting industry. Chris sat in silence as his name was dragged through the mud. The media, split down the middle, debated his motives. Some believed him, others mocked him. Headlines blurred between scandal and satire. Then something broke. An anonymous source leaked a short, grainy video to an independent journalist. Within hours, it hit the internet. The footage was from the night of the party, security cam footage from an upper hallway. It showed Diddy speaking to a man in a grey suit. A briefcase changed hands. Seconds later, Diddy turned the corner toward where Chris had been standing. The footage didn't capture words, but the exchange was clear, deliberate, secretive, and damning. Social media exploded. Hashtags like Diddy Briefcase and Justice for Jenna trended within hours. News outlets scrambled for context. Legal analysts began re-evaluating the entire case. Public opinion, which had wavered, now tilted firmly in Chris's favor. Chris watched the video again and again. It was the man he'd heard speaking that night, the same clipped voice. The briefcase passed like currency. It confirmed everything he'd testified. Maybe not the full picture, but enough. Still, no one knew where the footage had come from. The prosecution moved quickly to validate the clip, while the defense tried to discredit it. Diddy remained silent, showing no reaction in court. His smirk was gone. The next morning, the judge announced an emergency closed session. Legal jargon filled the courtroom, but one detail pierced through the noise. Chris Evans and Sean Combs were to be present, alone. No jury, no cameras, just the two of them and the judge. Chris's stomach turned. He wasn't afraid of facing Diddy, not anymore, but he knew this wasn't about the trial on paper. This was about leverage, power. What came next? As he was led to the chambers, escorted but isolated, he couldn't help but think of Jenna's words. You need to be careful. He had been careful, and still the danger had followed. Now it was face to face. The room was smaller than Chris expected. No press, no jury, no distractions. Just the judge at the head of the table, flanked by legal counsel, and across from him, Sean Combs, calm as ever, his hands clasped, his expression unreadable. Chris took his seat. The door clicked shut behind him. The judge began with procedural statements, a formality. Then silence. A moment passed. Chris could feel Diddy's gaze, cool and unwavering. Then Diddy spoke. "You think you understand what you saw?" he said, his voice low, measured. "You don't." Chris didn't respond. "You walked into something that's been moving long before you ever touched fame," Diddy continued. "And now you're trying to burn it down. For what? A headline?" Chris's voice was steady. "I didn't ask to be part of this. You brought me in." That night, those words, you knew someone was listening. Diddy leaned forward. "You think this trial ends anything? You think they'll stop just because a camera caught a briefcase?" Chris locked eyes with him. "No, but at least the world will know." The judge intervened, reminding both men of the boundaries, but it was clear this moment wasn't about law. It was about intimidation. Chris had seen it before, on sets, in meetings, in press rooms, but never this naked, never this personal. Then Chris did something no one expected. He pulled out a small USB stick and slid it across the table. "What's this?" the judge asked. "A recording," Chris said, "from the night of the party." Gasps followed. Even Diddy's composure cracked. "I didn't know it had caught anything," Chris continued. "It was from a backup mic I was testing for an upcoming project. I forgot it was running. Until yesterday." The recording, later verified and submitted into evidence, captured a fragment of the conversation in the corridor. It wasn't crystal clear, but the voices were identifiable. And the words, "Make sure he doesn't," "Silence from the East Coast," rang unmistakably. It was the final nail. The courtroom resumed full session later that week. The recording was played in front of the jury. The mood shifted. Even the defense team looked rattled. Analysts on the outside began preparing for what seemed inevitable. Chris didn't attend the final day. His statement was already given, his part played. He watched from a safe location surrounded by agents waiting for the outcome. It didn't take long. Guilty. Multiple counts. The jury had deliberated for less than 3 hours. The verdict was unanimous. When the news broke, Hollywood reeled. Some distanced themselves, others doubled down in denial, but most stayed silent. Fear still hung in the air, fear of who else might be involved, of what else might surface. Chris walked out of that chapter a different man, not broken, but hardened. He knew there'd be consequences, roles lost, endorsements dropped, but he also knew he had done something most wouldn't. He told the truth. Weeks later, he sat quietly at home, watching the news cycle spin. Jenna was still missing. The photo with the red X was still etched in his mind, but for the first time in months, the silence wasn't unbearable. It was freedom. If you were stunned by what Chris Evans revealed, subscribe now for more unbelievable stories from behind the red carpet. We dive deep into the truths Hollywood doesn't want you to hear. And don't miss the next video on screen. It uncovers the darkest secrets of Hollywood's inner circle. Click now and keep uncovering what lies beneath the surface.